Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this Wednesday evening, East Coast time. My name is Emily Mora. I am with Decoding Dyslexia North Carolina, and we are honored to have Dr. Jennifer King with us this evening to help increase our awareness and understanding around dysgraphia. She is an expert speaker, a research scientist, a family member to those with disabilities in written expression. She is a vocal advocate as well as being the founder of Dysgraphia Life, which she'll tell us more about. It provides information and support and resources around writing difficulties. In 2023, she co authored a book on dysgraphia IEPs, as well as many other scientific publications in all the work that she does. So I am very happy to pass it over now to Dr. King. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Emily, and to everybody for, joining me on a busy weeknight. I really appreciate everyone getting out there to learn more about dysgraphia. So as Emily said, I'm a research scientist, I'm an advocate, and I'm also a parent to a child with dysgraphia. And so I come at the talk kind of from all of those angles put together, which you'll see throughout the night. Let's see if I can get the slides to advance. There we go. So Dysgraphia Life is our organization. You can find it here at dysgraphia.life. But basically we provide education and information to parents, just like many of you, resources, success stories. We also run a parent-focused webinar series roughly quarterly. We just had one on assistive technology a couple weeks ago, and we have free recordings of all of those. We have an ebook, we have a professional database, and I'll mention at the moment, we have a brand new online education site called Dysgraphia Learn. So if you're interested in more than you hear tonight, go explore the website, learn more, and we would love to hear from you. So tonight, we're going to focus more on the writing side of things, decoding dyslexia. I assume you get a lot of information about reading disabilities. Tonight, we're going to think about the opposite side. I always tell people, if you think of dyslexia as trouble reading the information into your brain, dysgraphia is when you have all the information in your brain and you can't write it out. So we're really thinking about the opposite. But what we find is that many people, one, don't know dysgraphia exists at all, and two, don't really see it at first, because this is kind of a typical presentation that we see, is that you have a student, sometimes an adult, who really seems bright in conversation, but is extremely avoidant, complaining, avoiding homework, doesn't write, writes as little as possible, one-word answers, is doing all the math in their head, but isn't writing it down, has messy writing, and is acting out at school. So a lot of times you're not even thinking about, oh, this is a writing problem. It seems like a behavior or frustration problem or something like that. And so this is one of the profiles of a student that we really want people to watch out for, these sort of writing avoidant students. So today we're really going to talk through, and I was asked to speak on kind of these 5 bullets. What is dysgraphia? Signs of dysgraphia, what professionals might be targeting different types of dysgraphia intervention, both school and private. The biggest section will be on accommodations and IEP goals, and I try to focus a lot on practical things that you can do even if you don't have a formal plan, because a lot of people do not. And then questions that families should ask. So first, okay, am I back? I think I'm back. Okay, so first I want to make the point that we don't know enough about dysgraphia. More research is needed, and you'll kind of hear that as a theme throughout the night. If you go to the National Library of Medicine and look up dyslexia, here you can see I have circled like nearly 12,000 scientific publications on dyslexia. If you do the same thing for dysgraphia, there's 7 times less. So a lot of places throughout the talk, you'll see we don't know the answers. The research isn't there. We really need more research on dysgraphia and more people trying to understand it. And of course, in our current situation where we're seeing education research get defunded and cut, that's going to be a problem. We really need to think about how do we learn more about dysgraphia as we're moving forward. So what do we know? What is dysgraphia? And the answer, unfortunately, right now is, well, that depends. It depends on who you ask, even when you ask different types of professionals. The original ask for this talk said, can you clear up misconceptions? And I'm going to do my best, but not always, because really reputable resources conflict in how they define things. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of that. One thing that we're really pointing to at the moment is the World Health Organization's newest international classification of diseases, which is called ICD-11. It's the upcoming system for the World Health Organization to classify different types of diseases around the globe. And in that new system, dysgraphia is actually a stated synonym or matching term for the same thing as developmental learning disorder with impairment in written expression. And here's the description of that there. I don't need to read the entire thing, but it's really about difficulties in learning academic skills related to writing. So they really consider dysgraphia the same as what we'll talk about in a moment as a specific learning disability in written expression, where you're having trouble with those skills related to writing, which can include spelling, grammar, and punctuation, as well as organization and coherence of ideas. Now, the problem comes in that ICD-11 is not yet implemented yet. So right now, we're still in the ICD-10 system. ICD-10 does have a similar code. It's got, unfortunately, between 10 and 11, the codes change. But in ICD-10, there is a code for specific developmental disorders of scholastic skills, and there's one for disorder of written expression. So most of our community actually really would fit under this definition. But what's really confusing is that they have the term dysgraphia under a different area in ICD-10. So right now in ICD-10, dysgraphia points to a coordination disorder under nervous and musculoskeletal systems. And that's really historically true because of people thought dysgraphia was very specific to handwriting and just the handwriting component of written expression. So what we see now, and no one is really wrong in how they say this, but there are camps of people who really think about all of written expression. And then there's others who say, no, dysgraphia really just speaks to that handwriting motor coordination piece, not all of written expression. So what about other people? APA and their DSM-5 doesn't use the word dysgraphia at all, but they do have the impairment in written expression and a diagnostic code for that, which can be subdivided into spelling, grammar, or organization. And a lot of people are diagnosed through, and we'll talk about diagnosis and assessment in a little bit, but through a psychological, neuropsychological evaluation. So here you can get this impairment in written expression diagnosis. My current favorite definition is from this paper, this is actually a pediatrician who wrote a review article on dysgraphia with some others. And they said, at the broadest definition, dysgraphia is a disorder of writing ability at any stage, including problems with letter formation, legibility, letter spacing, spelling, fine motor coordination, rate of writing, grammar, and composition. So this is very, very broad, but as I'll show you in a minute, this is what we really sort of relate to as we look at our dysgraphia community. This is a different professional neuropsychologist who has created a writing assessment that can be used in neuropsych evaluations. And in his assessment, they actually look at 3 different types of dysgraphia and separate out graphomotor dysgraphia for motor skills, what he calls dyslexic dysgraphia, which some people find confusing, but that's the spelling, phonologic, or orthographic, like the spelling piece, and then executive dysgraphia, which is more the working memory, the organization, and executive function. So this particular test tests for those different subtypes within a dysgraphia definition. Now, working when he actually gave a webinar for our community, we asked during a poll, like, oh, which one of these does your child have? And the write-in votes were really interesting. Everybody was like, all three, or these two, or whatever. So at one point we have done, and I'll refer to this kind of quick community snapshot a few times throughout the talk, but we did a quick needs assessment survey. I was just thinking we need to redo it because it was at the end of 2021, early 2022. And it was open to anyone in our community. We really recruited online. So not scientific, we obviously somewhat biased for an online sample, but we got a lot of parents and a lot of people to tell us what they were seeing and they were experiencing. And we found kind of exactly that. We asked, what areas does your child find most difficult? People said all three, or a combination of the two. As you can see, all of these are above 75%. So most of the people whose children are having difficulty in written expression are not saying it's just handwriting or it's just this composition piece. It's really a mix of a lot of these different things. And that becomes really important later when we talk about accommodation and intervention and what you need to think about for your own child. Also, in a different effort, we worked with Don Johnston and Text Help to survey educators and school staff to see what they were seeing on the ground around the country. And this is data from 200 different educators, where they asked, what are some of the ways that you see students struggling when they're having trouble writing? And we see the same answer when you look from the teacher side, that there's really, really high rates of all of these things. Putting thoughts into sentences, spelling, grammar, punctuation, handwriting actually comes in fifth on the list. So it's not, in this case, a handwriting specific thing. So how does that play into schools? We talked about different definitions of dysgraphia, but what's important for many, many parents is, what does that look like in a school-based setting? So similar to dyslexia, in a school-based setting, we really think about IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And underneath that, there's a definition of specific learning disability. That is what most of the students in our community would qualify under. And so this definition, the bold part is what I'm going to show you is really important, is that a specific learning disability means a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language. And as you go through their examples, it very clearly says that this includes written language, and it might be in the imperfect ability to think. We talked about trouble getting those thoughts out, write, or spell. And so everything that I've just talked about really does fall underneath this definition of specific learning disability. So for a school-based diagnosis and for qualification for special education services, in most schools, we find that you really need a student to qualify under specific learning disability and written expression, and most school districts will not accept the term dysgraphia because it's more thought of as a medical diagnosis, not a school-based diagnosis. And I saw, looking at the Decoding Dyslexia North Carolina website, that there's a great sort of map of how to go through the IEP process, and even a discussion of medical versus school-based diagnosis. And so this falls right in line with that. We really want to think about specific learning disability and written expression. Again, your language can matter, which terms you're asking for as you approach the school can matter. This is a Facebook post that the Learning Disabilities Association of America put out about that they use the term learning disability purposefully, even though many people will say learning difference. Parents don't want to kind of put any type of shame on their child, but they say very clearly there is no shame in the term disability. We use the term learning disability because it provides those protections under the law, under laws like IDEA and ADA. So why do we use the term dysgraphia? People get it. You're a dyslexia organization. You understand, people understand the term dyslexia more probably than specific learning disability and reading. Same thing with dysgraphia. As we explain, it's kind of the flip side of dyslexia. People understand. And so sort of our big takeaway from this part is that we probably as a community need to harmonize these definitions, because as you saw, different places are using different definitions. But what we see in the real world is that it is very common to have problems with multiple different aspects of written expression. And today, for the rest of the talk, I'm going to use the term dysgraphia in that broad sense to understand all the different aspects of written expression that could fall under a school-based specific learning disability in written expression. Okay, so signs of dysgraphia. I already talked a little bit about, that avoidant student. What other things are you looking for, and when do you start to see these signs? So what we see is that it's often around age 7 or 8. That's actually relevant because it's when the writing tends to increase in a school-based setting. And so when the writing starts to become more difficult, then it becomes more and more evident that these students are having challenges putting their thoughts onto paper. Children start to struggle in school, homework battle, we talked about avoidance. There's the handwriting component. The handwriting can be unclear, difficult to read. Spacing is often a problem. Some children will complain of hand pain while writing or arm pain while writing. We see a lot that spelling is just, they're not picking up the spelling. They don't know the spelling words. They're not learning it as fast as their peers. There's a lack of capitalization, punctuation, spacing when writing. One of the things that I have found really notable is the copying. It's a lot of dysgraphic students can see it right in front of them up on the board and can't copy it onto their paper. And so to me, that's become kind of a telltale sign where most of us are like, but it's right there. And they still can't manage to write that sentence or whatever it is onto the paper. And the classic thing that we hear is, my student has all these great thoughts, but can't get them out on paper. And we'll talk about technology. It's not just paper sometimes, it's technology too. So what does that look like as a community? Like I said, we need a lot more research. There is not great prevalence data on dysgraphia, partially because if you don't know what your definition is and what you're measuring, you can't measure how many people actually have it. So we do know it should be pretty high. There's one study where the prevalence was about 7 to 15% among school-aged children, which is quite high. That review I showed you talks about between 10 and 30% of children experiencing writing difficulty, but they acknowledge the problem that if you can't define, you can't pick an exact number. But there are a lot of students that have dysgraphia. Some studies show that it can be more common in boys. And it can definitely be accompanied by other learning disabilities or other types of neurological disorders, including dyslexia, ADHD, and others. But it is important to note that just like dyslexia, dysgraphia does not impact intelligence or IQ. So again, when you look at that sort of community snapshot, we see around 7, 8, 6 through 9, a lot of the students beginning to be diagnosed, but some much earlier, some later. In adults, we find that almost no one was formally diagnosed at this point, because back then no one was even thinking about it. We have a lot of adults who are like, oh, I've had this all my life and I had never had any idea. So there's very little formal diagnosis in adults, although many people recognizing that this is something that they may have actually struggled with. And again, this was from the community snapshot on other learning differences, with ADD or ADHD coming up the highest, but also a significant amount of students saying they had both dysgraphia and dyslexia or other types of learning differences. So this is just, I'm not going to go into the research details here, but one thing I get asked a lot that I don't have a really good answer for is this spelling component, and like, how do dysgraphia and dyslexia overlap? Because in certain parts of both disorders, there's kind of a clear overlap of not being able to process the spelling and how that works. And so I don't have a great answer for how to kind of separate them out, or the Venn diagram. I'll go back to my more research is needed. But this is a really interesting study, because what they showed is that they took students with dysgraphia and students with dyslexia, and they did brain MRI studies, and they could actually show that there were different areas of the brain that were affected in the two groups of students. Now, I will say that this was when, dysgraphia was defined by handwriting problems too. And so the dysgraphia students were all handwriting impaired. We haven't done it on a group that, handwriting's not an issue for them, but it does show that there is likely some neurological differences even between the potentially overlapping areas in dyslexia and dysgraphia that, I'll go back to. More research is needed to really understand the neuroscience here and what is happening in all of these students. So takeaways. Dysgraphia is common, and we really do need more research on exact prevalence to understand how common it is. We start to see it the most around first or second grade when those writing tasks get difficult. It cannot co-occur with learning and attention disorders, and there's so much more we need to know. And that's one of the reasons Dysgraphia Life is here, is to sort of push that advocacy, push that awareness, both to help students, but also to promote the research. Okay, so what professionals, I'm just checking my time, make sure I stay on time. I know I've been going fast, but I wanted to make sure I get through all the information and leave a few minutes at the end. So what professionals target dysgraphia intervention? It's not as easy a question as you would think. And I'm going to start with assessments. I won't go deep into this, but just some basic information. Again, there is not a standard assessment, which is, again, a problem. Typically, we recommend a full comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation by a psychologist, which can either be done in a school-based setting or outside by a private neuropsychologist. This is similar with dyslexia in a lot of ways. There's a full evaluation done. I'll show you the components in a minute, and they use all the pieces together to really diagnose the dysgraphia and or specific learning disability of written expression. So the challenge here is that there isn't a standard group of tests. So we can't say, go do these tests. Different people are doing it different ways, and different people are interpreting it in different ways. One of the things that we do struggle with is that a lot of schools are not used to testing for the written expression piece. They're much more familiar with testing for the reading disabilities. So unfortunately, when we did that poll, 2/3 of the poll respondents reported that they actually went out and got their kid tested privately. And that is a huge disparity because, as some of you may know, those private evaluations are extremely expensive, and they're great and comprehensive, but they are not affordable for everyone. And so it's a big challenge in our community that what we're seeing is the students who are getting services tend to be the ones who have the means to go out and get those outside evaluations. So it's something we're definitely trying to raise awareness of, that this is very common. There should be more standardized assessment so that we can diagnose more students in a school-based setting. I will point out there's also occupational therapy assessments. And so we see some people come in starting from that handwriting piece, because sometimes that will be identified younger, more kindergarten age, as they're starting to write. If students are struggling with the handwriting piece, they will sometimes go get an OT assessment first before doing the neuropsych. And so we will see people sort of eventually feed into the dysgraphia path coming from occupational therapy. So that can go either way, as I'll talk about a little bit later. Once you have that diagnosis, you can also get request an occupational therapy assessment as part of an IEP plan, and potentially get services to help with handwriting. But sometimes it starts the other way too. So we see multiple different paths. This is the cognitive constructs that you really want assessed if you're going to have a full neuropsychological evaluation. So we talked about intelligence. Intelligence should be normal. In many students, it's high. We see a lot of these twice exceptional students that are very highly intelligent, but also have dysgraphia. Similarly with dyslexia, there's 2E students who are, highly intelligent and gifted levels in some schools, but also have dyslexia. But then you also want to have them assess visual motor integration and how those are working, measures of attention, working memory, executive function skills, writing and spelling skills specifically, phonological awareness, and retrieval fluency. And so those are all things that you would want to go into a comprehensive evaluation. I want to point out, and these are two cognitive scientists at Johns Hopkins who have spoken for our group and who are really great because they focus very specifically on dysgraphia. Interestingly, they got there from originally focusing on agraphia, where people had traumatic injuries and lost the ability to write. And now they've sort of moved into developmental dysgraphia and how this works developmentally. But they talk about the importance of individual assessment, even at the level of spelling, in that they have students that they have tested and worked with who have different types of spelling difficulties. Some who have this whole world spelling knowledge that they can't spell kind of whole words in different ways, that they learn fewer words on average from from sight words and things like that. And others that have conversion issues, the sound to spelling, and they can't convert that sound to really understand what the spelling looks like, showing implausible spellings. And then they have some kids that have problems with both. And so the individual assessment is really important, because not only will it tell you, as we get into the accommodations piece, what types of accommodations might help your student the most, but it also really can help to target the goals and the learning and where you might want remediation and help to help the students develop skills to overcome some of their challenges. So then once you have a good assessment, what types of professionals are we thinking about? We just talked about the evaluation piece. I talked about the different types of diagnosis and that occupational therapy could go in. I'll get to assistive technology more a little bit later, but that is another type of evaluation you can request in multiple settings, including a school-based setting. But then for interventions, we see a lot of different levels of intervention. So I put a lot of different types of professionals or not professionals on this list, because many of the things I'm going to talk about today can be done by a classroom teacher or a parent who's acting as a homeschool teacher. Not everything has to be delivered specifically through special education. But obviously there's a huge place for that too. We also see help from occupational therapy, specifically in the handwriting piece. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Assistive technology can be helpful. And then the dyslexia community is probably pretty familiar with some of the language therapists, educational therapists who really help with very specific language skills that can also help students with spelling and writing as well. And then I put advocate on this list because I just talked about all the challenges in determining if someone has dysgraphia and being able to actually qualify as specific learning disability and written expression. And we do find a huge need for advocates to come help parents and teachers and others to really make their case and help qualify for services. We do have one resource that's kind of growing over time, which is a professionals database, where we are creating a database of different types of professionals who are familiar with and work with dysgraphia. So you can go in and look if there's anyone in your area or that works virtually that may be of help. And so I put the link in the corner. And I can give a copy of these slides after the talk. Okay, so takeaways from the professionals piece. Full psychological testing is really the best way to diagnose, sometimes coupled with OT evaluation. Many school districts, unfortunately, are not well trained yet in recognizing this disability, and we're seeing a lot of educational disparities from those who can go outside the school and get that private testing and those who cannot. And individual assessment becomes really important as we move to the next section and think about how can you help the student in front of you, whether it's your child or whether it's a student in your classroom. You really want to think about what are the areas that this child needs help with. Okay, so this is the part people really usually want the most, which is what can I do? What are the interventions and accommodations that are helpful? I just made this point. They should be very individualized to the students. So when you're thinking about intervention and accommodations, It's going to depend on the types of challenges that the student is having. Is it motor and handwriting? Is it spelling? Is it organization and composition? Is it a combination of those things? It's also going to depend on their age, their grade level, and the complexity of work that's being expected of them. And just like dyslexia, like other learning disabilities, dysgraphia is not something that people are going to outgrow. There is some remediation. There are places that you can learn and improve your skills, but also throughout life, there is a lot of management and accommodation too. And we talk to a lot of dysgraphic adults who tell us about, their tricks and tools and how they make their lives easier through that accommodation piece, even though they have maybe caught up some, but it is really something that you live with. So school-based help, I won't go into this very deeply. A lot of you are probably very familiar, but really there's two paths. One, at least right now, one is 504 plans named after Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And underneath a 504 plan, you can get classroom accommodations for the most part that can really help the student be at a level playing field with the other student in the classroom. And then individual education programs, or IEPs, are legal documents under IDEA. And the IEP has a lot of detail and structure. I'm sure there's a lot of information. There's a lot in the dyslexia world about IEPs and how to put those together and things like that. But we think of them as having these measurable annual goals. And so they're very goal-based. They can also include the accommodations, but they're aiming at different goals. So I'll give you some examples throughout the talk of goals that can be used for specific learning disability of written expression. So I'm going to start, and I'm going to mostly focus on elementary school. Unfortunately, I would say most of the content that's out there, most of the help that's available is very focused on elementary school. There is less out there right now really for middle and high school. I will touch on it at the end, but we find a lot more resources when we're thinking at the elementary school level. So I'll talk a little bit more to that. At that level, we really see people focus on handwriting interventions. Early on, when the whole class is still working on handwriting, that's the time to work on handwriting. You do see some introduction of spelling and grammar rules and technology, but the focus with the younger students often is on handwriting and how much you can improve the handwriting. So as you think about handwriting and fine motor, this is where occupational therapy can be a huge help. There are a lot of great trained occupational therapists who will go through pencil grips, hand strength, how to properly form the letters, all sorts of pieces of occupational therapy that can be a huge help to your student. I will say there are benefits to both school-based and outside of school occupational therapy. Again, this is something that there can be disparities. What we find is that school-based OT really is focused truly on academic skills. But there are skills that dysgraphic students will also sometimes struggle with that are completely outside of school. A classic one is shoe tying. A lot of the students who cannot write letters right also cannot manipulate the shoelaces to tie them correctly at the same age. And we'll find that OT outside of school, they will actually work on things like shoe tying, whereas in school, often they will not, because it is not an academic skill. So I just want to flag that difference. If you're thinking about how to help your student, it might be worth looking at options in both ways and seeing what you think would be most helpful to your student. One thing that I can't say enough is to ensure that handwriting is purposeful. I'll come back to this a couple times, but it is very important. Handwriting is hard for these students. As we said, there are students that talk about pain. It is difficult. It is stressful. Things that do not help them are, hey, copy all the homework assignments off the board. That's something that's very, very common, and it is not really giving your student any explicit practice. So you want to use writing as a tool for explicit language instruction. Use writing when you're working on spelling, use writing when you're working on how to form a sentence, have them write really purposefully When it doesn't have to be written, there's more and more technology that can easily be incorporated to not just have copying for no particular reason. You can snap a picture of the assignments on a computer or a phone. There's ways to take out some of that extra writing so that when the students are writing, they can really think about writing and improving their writing skills. Along with letters, spacing, things like that. Spacing, capitalization, and punctuation are skills that really need to be taught explicitly to dysgraphic students. Where do you put the period? How much space do you leave? They don't pick it up in the same way that some of the other students do. It really needs to be purposeful, explicit teaching. We talk a lot about cursive. Cursive is not taught in many schools anymore, but if you really think about it, cursive is actually a lot easier for a dysgraphic student. I've done versions of this where we do exercises where you draw letters and you like look at where all the letters start. But the real answer is that as you're printing, your letters start everywhere. You have to remember that visual motor in many different ways. If you're writing in cursive, all the letters start in the bottom. They all connect. They all start from the same spot. And so it actually is a much easier way for many students. It doesn't work for every student, but it is something to really consider trying for students with dysgraphia, because some of them really take to cursive a lot better than they do to print. And then again, on handwriting and fine motor, for some students, hand strengthening, fidgets, games, things like that can really help them with their fine motor skills. We have a lot of suggestions of kind of fine motor games, tweezers, things like that that come out of the OT world that can really help with those fine motor skills. So as I said, a lot of this stuff is things that you can do at home that you don't have to do at school. You can think about how to play these motor skills games. You can really, I see a lot of people teaching cursive outside of the school setting. There's a lot of things in here that parents can really think about doing as well. So then to accommodations. And again, some of these can be on formal plans. Other things, sometimes you can actually sort of slip into classrooms without formal plans too. I have sent spacing paper to many, many classroom teachers, often who have used it, whether it was in the formal plan or not. I had one teacher take spacing paper that I sent in and photocopy the paper and use it for other students as well. So sometimes this stuff can be used pretty easily. I will point out on the bottom, we have a resource page that has a lot of this stuff on it. So if you're looking for specific examples or things to get, you can go look there. But there are a lot of accommodations that can help with handwriting. That spacing paper is the number one thing. There's a couple different kinds. Different people like different kinds, but showing the students, giving them that structure and that explicit instruction of where to form the letters, where the big part goes, where the small part goes, how much you space it apart, can be really, really important. Slant boards can help with pencil grip and arm positioning and how that goes. Some students take to certain pens and pencils. Pencil grips, I actually don't have on this one, but that's a really common one too. The grip to make sure that you are holding your pencil correctly. Fidget tools, things like that. Also on 504 plans or IEPs, many of our students get extra time on writing assignments. It's actually one of the most common things we see students get. You can also get no or reduced copying. We talked about that, pictures of the boards, note for classes, scribes, early utilization of keyboarding. I'll come back to that. And one that people don't think about, and it's going away, but it's not completely going away yet, is there are standardized tests still where you have to fill in the bubble. And that is really, really difficult for these students. So that is one accommodation we have seen in a school-based setting. So handwriting, what's an example of what an IEP goal could look like for handwriting? These are all supposed to be measurable, achievable goals. Here, there's a lot of places you can fill in, but student's name will write the following elements with correct size, spacing, and orientation to the line. You can add using an accommodation such as spacing paper. You're allowed to put accommodations in the goal. And then how do you measure it? What's your tool or rubric, and what's the goal and date? And so examples of what this could be printing their name, upper or lower case, manuscript, cursive, what are the numerals, or you could put in complete sentences. So different ways to create a handwriting goal that fits your student as you move forward. Another important note is to really think about the student and capitalize on the strengths and interests. And this is on our success stories page. I've pulled it out into a slide, but it's one I really like, which was a second grade boy with dysgraphia who wanted to be a vet when he grew up, and he was working with an OT. The OT came up with this project that the end game was he went home and told his parents, I love to write when it's about animals. Like a student who's always hated to write everything. I love to write when it's about animals. So what they did was they traced the animal. So you can think of all the fine motor there out of a book, colored it in. Here's the tiger with the stripes and all of that. They would write a few sentences as a first in kind of a rough draft. They use the accommodations. Here's an example of spacing paper. If you look really closely, you can see between each letter, there's a little line. So it tells you exactly where you put the letter, and then you leave an empty one for the space. So it really helped with how you space things so that they're legible. And then you go back and do another draft. You edit for grammar and capitalization and punctuation. And this student ended up kind of creating a whole book of different animals where they practiced, tracing and writing, and actually enjoyed it, and it was a positive experience. And so when you can capitalize on the strengths and interests of the children that you're working with, or your own child, to really make it more enjoyable, make it more exciting, and make it something they're proud of, that goes a long way too. All right, I've referenced this a bunch of times, but assistive technology. So assistive technology can be really important. We generally say by mid to late elementary to ask for a school-based assistive technology evaluation. I will say in our expert webinar series, this is a question almost every time we have any expert in. Someone in the audience asks, when should I switch from handwriting to keyboarding? Almost everybody says there's not a specific time to switch over. It depends on the student, but that it does not hurt to teach typing, to introduce keyboarding, to introduce technology early so that the student builds up the skills for how to use it as you go on. So that assistive technology may change over time, but it's good to have options, and it's good to understand that most of these students, when they get to later grades, are going to be using laptops, computers, some type of technology. And so teaching those skills early does help them down the line. Now, I will say there are benefits to teaching handwriting, and there is science and literature on why teaching handwriting is important too. So you don't want to skip handwriting entirely. It definitely helps with the language skills, but for the ease of student performance as they get older, assistive technology can be extremely important. So there's a lot of options. Early keyboarding, you can have touch typing IEP goals. This is allowed. Your goal would be so many words per minute. Your goal would be certain types of things. Word prediction software is one that a lot of people are starting to use, where when you start to type it, it's just like on your phone. When you start to type in the word, the predicted word comes up. And so it saves a lot of stress in both the typing and the spelling of the words. Voice to text is very, very common in our community. It has improved a lot. It is free in many programs. So in Google Docs, you can go under voice typing, and you can turn on free voice typing and talk. In Microsoft Word, there's also a dictate button. And so this comes with these programs that are pretty freely accessible, and it's becoming widely used. It's getting better and better with AI. I'm not going to go deep into AI tools. We can do that in the questions if you want. But we have written some blogs on it. But the voice to text is getting a lot better, and students practice with it and learn how to use it, where they'll say the sentence, say period, and pause. The one thing I will say about voice to text is that you need a lot of editing. So As you use voice to text, it is also a way to practice editing skills. Do voice to text and then come back and work on how do you edit that into what you actually meant it to be, because people speak a little more casually than you might want your written composition. And then there are a lot of apps and software out there now that do things like scan in worksheets that will allow you to do math online. This technology is improving all the time. And so it really can help students to have access to this technology at earlier ages, and to not have to physically write all the answers to everything. So switching gears a little bit, we talked about the handwriting, we talked about the technology, now the actual writing skills. So this is from that study with text help that I told you about, where we talked with school staff, and less than half of the respondents in that survey said that they had a writing specialist at their school. There are a lot of schools now that will have reading specialists. Very few schools, well, less than half here. Around me, I feel like it's even less than that, have writing specialists thinking about teaching writing. And so what's really important as we think about how to intervene and for students with dysgraphia is that they really need explicit instruction in all aspects of writing. And this includes a lot of things. Remember the definition of dysgraphia that was pretty broad, that falls into this whole long list of things you need to think about when teaching writing. We talked about things like letter spacing and punctuation already. But along with spelling and grammar, what are the basics that are in a sentence? I have punctuation on here twice, but what are your sentence basics? Then how do you take a simple sentence and expand that with descriptive words? How do you write a paragraph? How do introductions and conclusions work? And proofreading and editing. There's actually a lot of aspects of writing, and what we really want to stress is that explicit instruction piece. In a dyslexia audience, this is probably one that knows something about Orton-Gillingham approaches and structured literacy, but it's something we do also recommend for dysgraphic students. The Orton-Gillingham approach is really one that has these different concepts. It's structured and systematic. It builds sequentially as you learn grammar and spelling. It's really builds on itself sequentially, cumulative. Multi-sensory is a huge piece of this, where you learn not just by writing, but through other types of multi-sensory input. I'll give you an example in a minute on spelling. And then it's based in language principles and peer reviewed. We do not recommend one specific curriculum, but we do recommend to people that they look for curricula that follow these Orton-Gillingham and structured literacy principles as they're looking for how to teach grammar and spelling to students. We'll say, this approach hasn't really necessarily been the norm for dysgraphia. I think it varies in reading and dyslexia too, but when we polled, we found, less than half of people thought that their child had been taught using it. Many weren't sure. There's a smattering of answers like, they don't do it at school, but I'm trying to do it at home, and stuff like that. But it really hadn't been the norm for many people. So as we think about how to improve spelling and grammar instructions and how you can accommodate, I mentioned multisensory tools is a huge way. It is not hard to teach spelling using things other than just handwriting. And so that's something you can really think about even as you're practicing with your own child, if they have words they need to learn. Other accommodations you can use are that we talked about the early utilization of technology. We see people who have assignments and tests where their children will not have spelling graded. That is one school-based accommodation that you can sometimes get. And then there's use of checklists is another big one. How do you remind the student to go back, check for spelling, check for capitalization, check for punctuation as you're looking at their writing? So I mentioned this, spelling without worksheets. I think spelling worksheets are every parent of a student with dysgraphia's nightmare. It's never a good day when a spelling worksheet comes home. But there are so many ways to think about spelling that's not just copying the words onto worksheets. You can look at different magnetic letters, you can look at games. Writing in sand has a lot of that multi-sensory input. This is obviously a beach, but you can get little sand tables. Some Orton Gillingham curriculums will have putting a piece of paper over sandpaper so it feels rough to the touch and helps with that multi-sensory input. Songs, we all know how to spell words to famous songs where they're spelling, more games. And then this is the tapping from a lot of those OG curriculum. They really try to help encourage spelling in different ways. Ooh, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to keep going. Composition, organization of thought was our last kind of topic, which is to really think about the whole writing process. It's not just the actual writing, it's pre-writing and planning, writing, revising, editing, and then at the end, kind of finalizing and publishing. So there's another area that you need explicit instruction all the way through the process. Simple and complex sentences, introductions, how do you do a transition? A big need for explicit instruction. Here's kind of a classic accommodation graphic organizer. How do you put in your topic sentence, your 3 details, and your closing sentence? There's lots of graphic organizers out there for different types of writing assignments, outlines to fill in. Editing checklists are really good. And a lot of students like to have the grading rubric too, for how am I going to be graded on that? How does that help me edit my piece and make sure that my composition is where I want it to be? So those are all things that they can be given. Composition, IEP goals, writing cohesive paragraphs, expanding on a basic sentence and adding describing words, things like that can be added to really work on composition. And one thing that's really important is to consider, does the student have to do that in writing? Where and when can you talk about writing concepts without actually doing the writing? Can you have them give you a sentence? Okay, what are 3 details about that? What's one detail? What's another detail? What's another detail? Now, how would you sum that up? You can practice that act of a paragraph without actually writing it down. And that can really help a student and take a lot of that stress off. If you see me talk, I tell this story all the time, which is that small changes can make a big difference. This was a student who was given a huge assignment. It was their first ever multi-part assignment. They had to do this 10-chapter assignment on digital citizenship. And so, but at the end of every chapter, you would answer a whole page of questions. The student was very avoidant, didn't want to do it. The parent was upset because they were supposed to be working through it over, a 2-month period. Parent was upset, student was upset. Finally, they went and talked to the teacher and said, do we have to write out all the answers at the end of every chapter? Is this about writing? And the teacher said, no, it's about learning the concepts of, digital citizenship and not bullying people online and all of that. And they agreed that instead of writing out the answers, the student would just voice record the answer to each question and email it to the teacher. And it changed the entire project. The student was able to just do it and voice record the answers, started immediately, started getting it done, started sending it in. The parent was happy because it was getting done. The teacher was happy because the whole point was to learn the concept. It wasn't the writing. And so there are places that you can ask the question, do I need to do this in writing? And it can make a big difference. So that sort of sums up the elementary part. I'm going to fly through middle and junior high school. As I said, there's not as much here, but really what is different is the level of the writing, and that writing is in every class. And so composition gets more complicated, longer, more planning, more possibly note-taking. It just becomes more challenging. What's really important is to start to get input from the students. What kind of goals or accommodations do they want? Self-advocacy for the students. Teachers may not be as receptive in every single class. How can they advocate for themselves and include the student when appropriate in meetings? So the accommodations that we're seeing people actually get in middle school, high school are word processing, extra time, sometimes being allowed to audio record the lectures instead of doing note-taking, or having a note taker or a scribe. It's actually getting a lot easier these days with things like, Otter and note-taking online. So this is becoming more and more common. And then, like I said, can you, do an oral presentation of your work instead of writing a paragraph? Where do you need to do the writing, and where are some places you can take that writing burden off? And again, assistive technology, more and more every day are we seeing assistive technology that can help. So IEP goals are similar, here's make an outline across all classes. So not just an outline in language arts, but what was your outline in history look like? What does your outline in science look like? Are you doing your steps in the writing process, planning, writing a draft and editing and going through all of that? If you want more IEP goals, this is what our book looks like. It's on Amazon. You can find it. It's got them by grade. And so I will just end with sort of the high level takeaways that there are a lot of accommodations. There's a lot that you can do. There are many types of IEP goals that can help. They should be tailored to this student, and many are easier in younger grades, but awareness is growing. We're seeing a little bit more in middle school and high school now, and everybody's advocacy can help with that. So next steps, here's my list. This is something of questions you can ask. What aspects of writing are difficult for your child, and then tailor everything to that. Is it evident in a school-based setting? I encourage everyone, keep documentation, keep papers that come home, keep anything you could use in IEP meetings to show that your student might need extra help and support. How does my school system evaluate? Can I get an OT or AT evaluation too? What's available? Do we need an advocate? What accommodations are available? As I said, some of those are through formal plans, some of those are through informal conversations with teachers, and both are helpful. And then what other types of IEP goals are out there that other students at the school might have on written expression? If you have a child who has specific learning disability and written expression, don't let them give you reading goals. They need to be writing goals. And then what we talked about, how can I demonstrate this knowledge besides a written format? So little changes go a long way. Advocate for your student and know that there is a community and it's growing. I mentioned the success stories. We have a blog of success stories. You can go check it out. And this is our new online learning platform. It's at learn.dysgraphia.life. All four, these are the last 6 things we put up. There's a lot of things on here. All 4 of these blue and green ones are free parent-focused webinars on different topics. This one on the top left we just did, all about assistive technology and enhancing writing through technology. So feel free to go check it out. These are our first 2 courses that are a little bit more in depth. This one takes some of what I talked to you about tonight and turns it into like a larger 4-hour course focused on elementary education, mostly for teachers, but can be useful for parents too. So I went fast, but that was a lot. I'll check and see if we have any questions. I think I have 2 minutes officially, and I can stay on an extra minute or 2. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. King. That was incredible. Lots of wonderful information. Real quick, I just want to remind everyone, I know you all registered for tonight, so I will send out an email once I have the recording, and Dr. King's generously going to share the slides. I'll get all that set up and send out an email to everyone that registered that it's available for you to access. And it did look like if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I did catch 2 for you. Dr. King, someone was interested in that spacing paper.
Mm-hmm.
Link to that in your resources on your site.
Yes. So the one that I showed is the Ready Space paper. It's one of the top ones on the resource page, which is dysgraphia.life/resources. And that one is the Ready Space paper. There's some other examples too. Some of them like highlight certain areas and certain lines, but that one I do actually really like because you can buy a version of it that looks a lot like regular loose leaf, but it has those little marks to help with the spacing. And I do find a lot of students like that.
Perfect. Ready Space paper. The same person was also asking, they wanted to know more about that OT project, that writing about something they enjoyed. Is there a blog post or something that tells more about that project?
There is, although probably it doesn't have a lot more detail than I said. But yeah, that was someone's OT who really like designed that project and went through it with them. But I will send the slides, which sort of had the steps of what they did.
Wonderful. Let's see. Someone asked, is it common for kids with dysgraphia to do well on spelling tests when writing targeted words they've studied, but then spell poorly when writing more generally a sentence, etc.
It can be. That is actually more of a challenge that sometimes students will be able to kind of keep it when it's right there in front of you. You've been studying it this week, but the long-term memory of it and encoding of it is more difficult. So that can be a challenge for students for sure.
Absolutely. And then it looks like one other question. Let's see, where is the best place to get information about the dysgraphia diagnosis code in ICD 11?
So ICD-11, you can probably just Google it, who ICD-11, but they have a browser where you can type in different terms. And so if you type in dysgraphia, I'll send out the slides too, so you'll see it in there. But if you type in dysgraphia, that definition that I came up will actually come up in their browser.
You know when that changeover is happening from ICD 10 to 11?
Unfortunately, it's probably pretty slow. It took like a decade for ICD-10 to be fully implemented. So I don't think we yet really understand what that's going to look like.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. I'm interested in, and just lots of thank yous. Enjoyed your presentation, enjoyed the time, learned a lot. I'm interested in getting the list of different accommodations for middle and high school students. I assume that we'll be getting the slides,
Yeah.
but is that also listed on the website?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. There is I think, a section on the website, but it's definitely in some in the slides, and feel free to reach out as well.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yes. And if anything comes up for anyone after tonight, Dr. King has so generously put her email address, and feel free to reach out to us as well if we can be of support. Yes, just lots of compliments, lots of thank yous.
Great. Well, I'm glad you all enjoyed it. Have a great night. Please, we want you to go out there and raise awareness about dysgraphia too. So
Yes,
thank
and
you
check
for
out
coming. And
more information. Thank you so much, Dr. King. Everyone, take care. Have a good evening. And again, I'll be in touch with those resources.
sounds great. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Good night.